The sun rose over the capital city like any other Tuesday morning. Birds sang in the ancient oak trees that lined the embassy district, their cheerful songs mixing with the distant sound of morning traffic. The streets were clean and quiet, with only a few early joggers and dog walkers moving along the sidewalks. In a few hours, this peaceful neighborhood would be buzzing with diplomats, security personnel, and visitors from around the world. But, for now, it was just another quiet morning in the most important diplomatic quarter of the kingdom. Captain Marcus Sterling adjusted his red uniform jacket one final time before stepping out of the guardhouse. The morning air was crisp and fresh, carrying the scent of blooming flowers from the embassy gardens. At 32 years old, Marcus had been serving as a royal guard for nearly 12 years. His father had been a guard before him, and his grandfather too. The Sterling family had protected the royal family and served the kingdom for 3 generations. Marcus took pride in his work. Every morning, he polished his boots until they gleamed like mirrors. His uniform was always pressed and perfect, with every button shining and every crease sharp. The red fabric with its gold trim represented centuries of tradition and honor. When people saw him walking down the street, they knew immediately that he was someone who could be trusted, someone who would protect them and their country. The embassy district was Marcus's responsibility. Every day, he walked the same route, checking on each building and making sure everything was safe and secure. There were embassies from dozens of countries lining these streets. Some were in grand old mansions with beautiful gardens, while others occupied modern glass and steel buildings. Each one was like a small piece of another country, bringing different cultures and languages to their kingdom. Marcus knew many of the embassy staff by name. There was Mrs. Chun from the Eastern Republic, who always smiled and waved when she saw him. Mr. Petrov from the Northern Federation often stopped to chat about the weather. The ambassador from the island nations had invited Marcus to their National Day celebration last year, where he had tried foods he had never tasted before. But there was one embassy that always made Marcus feel uneasy. The Meridian Empire's embassy was housed in a massive stone building that looked more like a fortress than a diplomatic mission. The windows were small and narrow, and the staff rarely smiled or spoke to anyone outside their own circle. Their security guards wore dark uniforms and carried themselves with an arrogance that Marcus found troubling. The Meridian Empire was a powerful nation from across the sea. They had a large army and controlled important trade routes. In recent months, their relationship with Marcus's kingdom had become strained. There had been disagreements about trade agreements, fishing rights in disputed waters, and military exercises too close to their borders. Marcus had heard the older guards talking about the growing tensions. They remembered when relations between the two countries had been friendly. There had been royal visits, cultural exchanges, and profitable business partnerships. But those days seemed to be fading into memory as politicians on both sides became more suspicious and hostile toward each other. As Marcus began his morning patrol, he noticed unusual activity at the Meridian Embassy. Black cars with tinted windows were parked outside, and there seemed to be more security guards than usual. Through the iron gates, he could see people in expensive suits walking back and forth across the courtyard, talking on phones and carrying thick folders. Something important was happening, but Marcus did not know what it was. He continued his patrol, nodding to the familiar faces he encountered along the way. The postman, Mr. Defies, was starting his deliveries. The owner of the small cafe on Embassy Row was setting up tables outside for the breakfast crowd. Everything seemed normal on the surface, but Marcus could sense an underlying tension in the air. At exactly 9 o'clock, Marcus positioned himself at his usual post in the center of the district. From this spot, he could see all the main embassy buildings and monitor any unusual activity. It was a position of responsibility that he took seriously. The safety and security of dozens of diplomats and their families depended on his watchfulness. The morning proceeded quietly for the first hour. Embassy staff arrived for work, visitors came and went through the security checkpoints, and the usual daily business of international diplomacy continued as normal. Marcus exchanged pleasant greetings with several people he knew and helped a lost tourist find their way to the museum district. But at 10:15, everything changed. A long black limousine pulled up in front of the Meridian Embassy. The car was so polished that Marcus could see his reflection in its surface from 50 yards away. The windows were completely dark, making it impossible to see who was inside. As soon as the car stopped, 6 security guards in dark suits emerged from the embassy and formed a protective circle around the vehicle. Marcus watched with professional interest as the rear door of the limousine opened. A man stepped out who immediately commanded attention. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a military uniform covered with medals and ribbons. His hair was steel gray, and his face had the hard, weathered look of someone who had spent decades in positions of authority and power. Even from a distance, Marcus could tell this was someone very important. The way the other embassy staff members rushed to greet him, the respectful bows and handshakes, the careful attention to protocol, everything indicated that this man held a position of significant influence within the Meridian Empire. Marcus made a mental note to include this visit in his daily report. Royal guards were trained to observe and record any unusual activity in the embassy district, especially involving personnel from countries with strained relationships with their kingdom. This was clearly something that his supervisors would want to know about. The important visitor spent nearly an hour inside the embassy. During this time, Marcus noticed that the normal daily routine of the building had been completely disrupted. No other visitors were allowed to enter, and the usual stream of staff members coming and going had stopped entirely. Even the delivery trucks that normally brought supplies were turned away at the gate. Whatever meeting was taking place inside the embassy, it was serious enough to shut down all other business. Marcus had been taught to recognize the signs of important diplomatic activity. Increased security, restricted access, and the presence of high-ranking officials were all indicators that significant decisions might be made that could affect his kingdom's interests. He remained alert and ready to respond to any situation that might develop. At 11:30, the mysterious visitor emerged from the embassy. Marcus got a better look at him as he walked toward the waiting limousine. The man moved with the confident stride of someone accustomed to having his orders followed without question. His uniform was immaculate, with every decoration precisely placed. The expression on his face was stern and unsmiling. But instead of getting into the limousine immediately, the visitor stopped and looked around the street. His gaze swept across the embassy district, taking in the other buildings, the security arrangements, and the general layout of the area. When his eyes fell on Marcus standing at his post, he stared for several long seconds. Marcus maintained his professional posture, standing straight and alert in his red uniform. He met the visitor's gaze without flinching, though he could feel the intensity of the man's scrutiny. There was something in those eyes that Marcus did not like, a coldness and arrogance that suggested this person was not accustomed to being challenged or questioned. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 10 seconds, the visitor turned away and climbed into the limousine. The convoy of black cars pulled away from the embassy and disappeared around the corner, heading toward the international district where many foreign officials stayed when visiting the capital. Marcus remained at his post, but his mind was racing. Something about that encounter had left him feeling unsettled. The way the visitor had looked at him was not casual observation. It had been more like evaluation, as if the man was sizing up a potential obstacle or threat. For the rest of his shift, Marcus found himself thinking about what he had witnessed. Who was this important visitor from the Meridian Empire? What had been discussed in that closed-door meeting? And why had the man stared at him with such intensity? These questions would soon be answered in ways that Marcus could never have imagined. As the afternoon wore on, Marcus noticed subtle changes in the behavior of the Meridian Embassy staff. They seemed more tense and watchful than usual. The security guards at the gate were checking identification more carefully and taking longer with each person who wanted to enter the building. There was an air of anticipation, as if everyone was waiting for something important to happen. Marcus had learned to trust his instincts during his years of service. Right now, those instincts were telling him that the peaceful routine of the embassy district was about to be disrupted in a major way. He just did not know how or when. The answers would come sooner than he expected, and they would test everything he believed about duty, honor, and standing up for what was right, even when the consequences could be severe. The quiet morning that had started like any other was about to become the first chapter in a story that would change Marcus's life forever and create an international incident that would be remembered for years to come. As his shift neared its end, Marcus prepared his daily report. He documented the arrival and departure of the important visitor, noting the time, the increased security measures, and the general atmosphere of tension around the Meridian Embassy. It was a thorough and professional account of the day's events, written in the clear, precise language that his supervisors expected. But, as Marcus walked home that evening, he had no idea that his next encounter with the mysterious visitor would thrust him into the center of a diplomatic crisis that would test his loyalty, his courage, and his commitment to the principles he had sworn to uphold as a guardian of his kingdom and its values. The stage was set for a confrontation that would echo far beyond the quiet streets of the embassy district. 3 days had passed since the mysterious visitor's first appearance at the Meridian Embassy. Marcus had submitted his report and continued his regular patrol duties, but the image of that stern, metal-covered figure remained fixed in his memory. Something about the man's presence had felt like a dark cloud gathering on the horizon, promising a storm that had not yet arrived. The weather that Thursday morning matched Marcus's mood perfectly. Gray clouds hung low over the capital city, and a cold wind whistled through the embassy district. The normally cheerful birds seemed to have found shelter elsewhere, leaving the streets unusually quiet and somber. Marcus arrived at the guardhouse earlier than usual. He had not slept well the previous night, troubled by dreams he could not quite remember upon waking. As he put on his uniform, he took extra care with every detail. His boots were polished to a mirror shine, his jacket pressed to perfection, and every piece of brass gleaming like gold in the artificial light. Captain Rodriguez, the senior guard who supervised the embassy district, was waiting for Marcus when he emerged from the changing room. Rodriguez was a veteran of 25 years of service, a man who had seen enough of the world to recognize when something important was brewing beneath the surface of normal diplomatic routine. "Sterling," Rodriguez said, his voice carrying the weight of authority and concern. "I read your report about the visitor at the Meridian Embassy. Good work documenting everything. But I want you to be extra careful today. Intelligence reports suggest there might be some kind of announcement coming from the Meridian government. We do not know what it is, but our people in the foreign ministry are worried." Marcus nodded seriously. "Do you think it has something to do with the man I saw? The one with all the medals?" "Could be," Rodriguez replied. "The description you gave matches General Viktor Kozlov, one of their top military commanders. If he is here, it probably means they are planning something significant. Just keep your eyes open and report anything unusual immediately." With that warning echoing in his mind, Marcus began his morning patrol. The embassy district felt different today, charged with an energy that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Even the civilian staff at various embassies seemed more subdued than usual, speaking in hushed tones and glancing around nervously as they went about their business. The Meridian Embassy itself looked like a fortress preparing for siege. Additional security guards had been posted at every entrance, and Marcus counted at least 12 men in dark suits positioned around the building's perimeter. Black sedans were parked at strategic locations, their engines running as if ready for quick departure. At precisely 10 o'clock, Marcus received a radio call from headquarters that made his blood run cold. The message was brief and cryptic, but its implications were enormous. "All units be advised. The Meridian Empire has announced the deployment of naval forces to disputed territorial waters. Heightened security protocols now in effect." Marcus understood immediately what this meant. The two countries were moving closer to a direct military confrontation. The fishing rights and territorial disputes that had been simmering for months were now threatening to boil over into something much more serious. In the embassy district, this kind of news meant that tensions would be running higher than ever, and the potential for incidents would increase dramatically. As if summoned by the radio announcement, the familiar black limousine appeared at the end of the street. Marcus watched as it approached the Meridian Embassy, moving slowly and deliberately like a predator stalking its prey. The same convoy of security vehicles followed behind, creating an imposing procession that drew stares from everyone in the area. General Kozlov emerged from the limousine with the same commanding presence that Marcus remembered from 3 days earlier. But today, there was something different about the man's demeanor. He moved with the purposeful stride of someone who had come to deliver an important message, and his expression was harder and more determined than before. The general spent less time inside the embassy on this visit, only 45 minutes compared to the previous hour-long meeting. But when he emerged, everything about his body language suggested that significant decisions had been made. He walked with the satisfaction of a man who had accomplished an important mission. And then, to Marcus's surprise, instead of heading directly to his limousine, General Kozlov began walking across the street toward the center of the embassy district where Marcus was stationed. Marcus felt his heart rate increase as the general approached. Behind Kozlov, for security guards in dark suits followed at a respectful distance, their hands positioned near their concealed weapons. The general's eyes were fixed on Marcus with the same intense scrutiny that had made him so uncomfortable during their first encounter. When Kozlov was about 10 feet away, he stopped and studied Marcus for several long seconds. Up close, the general was even more intimidating than he had appeared from a distance. He stood at least 6 feet 4 inches tall, with broad shoulders and a thick chest decorated with rows of military ribbons and medals. His face was deeply lined and weathered, marked by decades of military service in harsh conditions. "You are the guard I saw earlier this week," Kozlov said in accented but clear English. His voice was deep and commanding, the kind of voice that was accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Yes, sir," Marcus replied, maintaining his professional posture and tone. "I am Captain Marcus Sterling of the Royal Guard." Kozlov nodded slowly, as if filing this information away for future reference. "I have been watching this district for several days now. Your kingdom has interesting methods of security. Very traditional." There was something in the way he said traditional that suggested it was not meant as a compliment. Marcus sensed criticism in the general's tone, but he remained silent and alert. "Tell me, Captain Sterling," Kozlov continued, "how long have you been serving in this position?" 12 years, sir," Marcus answered honestly. He saw no reason to withhold basic information about his service record. 12 years, Kozlov repeated, as if testing how the words sounded. "Long enough to develop certain habits, certain ways of thinking about duty and loyalty." Marcus was not sure where this conversation was leading, but every instinct told him to be careful. There was something predatory about the way Kozlov was circling around some unstated point, like a hunter preparing to spring a trap. "General, is there something specific I can help you with today?" Marcus asked, trying to maintain control of the conversation. Kozlov smiled, but it was not a warm or friendly expression. It was the smile of someone who enjoyed having power over others and was about to demonstrate that power. "Actually, yes," Kozlov said. "There is something you can do for me. Something that would demonstrate the respect that should exist between our two countries during this difficult time." The general paused dramatically, letting the weight of his words sink in. Around them, the embassy district had grown quiet, as if the very air was holding its breath to see what would happen next. "I want you to salute me," Kozlov said finally. "Right here, right now? Show me the proper respect due to a military officer of my rank and position." Marcus felt as if he had been struck by lightning. The request was so unexpected, so outrageous, that for a moment he could not believe he had heard it correctly. A foreign military officer was demanding that a royal guard of his own country salute him in public, in front of multiple witnesses, as a gesture of submission and respect. "Sir," Marcus said carefully, "I think there may be some misunderstanding about protocol. Royal guards salute members of our royal family and our own military commanders. We do not salute foreign officers." Kozlov's smile disappeared, replaced by an expression of cold anger. "There is no misunderstanding, Captain Sterling. I am a general in the Meridian Empire's military forces. Your little kingdom would be wise to show proper respect to representatives of a superior power." The words hit Marcus like physical blows. Superior power? This foreign general was standing on his country's soil, demanding submission from one of their own royal guards, and calling their kingdom inferior. Every fiber of Marcus's being rebelled against the insult. "General," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the anger building inside him, "I respect your position in your own military. But I am a royal guard of this kingdom, sworn to uphold our sovereignty and dignity. I cannot, and will not salute a foreign officer as a gesture of submission." The tension in the air became almost unbearable. Kozlov's 4 security guards had moved closer, their hands now openly resting on their weapons. From the embassy buildings around them, Marcus could see faces pressed against windows, watching the confrontation unfold. "You refuse?" Kozlov asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I respectfully decline," Marcus replied, choosing his words carefully but standing firm in his position. For several seconds, the two men stared at each other in complete silence. Marcus could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. He was acutely aware that this moment would be remembered and analyzed by people far more powerful than himself. Whatever he did next would have consequences that extended far beyond his own career or personal safety. Kozlov finally broke the silence. "This is most unfortunate, Captain Sterling. Most unfortunate indeed. You have made a choice today that you may come to regret." "I have made the only choice available to an honorable soldier," Marcus replied. The general's eyes flashed with fury, but he controlled himself with visible effort. "We shall see about that," he said quietly. Then, louder, so that his voice would carry to the watching embassy staff. Let it be known that the representatives of the Meridian Empire have been treated with disrespect and contempt by the military forces of this kingdom. This incident will be reported to my government with a recommendation for appropriate action." With that threat hanging in the air, Kozlov turned and walked back toward his waiting limousine. His security guards followed, but not before several of them gave Marcus looks that promised future trouble. The convoy pulled away with squealing tires, leaving Marcus standing alone in the center of the embassy district. As the sound of the engines faded into the distance, Marcus became aware that he was shaking slightly, not from fear, but from the adrenaline rush of having stood up to a bully who had tried to humiliate him and his country in public. But even as he felt pride in having done the right thing, Marcus knew that his troubles were just beginning. General Kozlov was not the kind of man who would simply accept being refused and move on. He would want revenge, and he would have the resources of an entire empire at his disposal to get it. The confrontation was over, but the real battle was about to begin. Within 2 hours of the confrontation with General Kozlov, Marcus found himself sitting in a conference room at Royal Guard headquarters that he had never seen before. The room was on the 5th floor of the building, with heavy oak paneling and portraits of former Guard commanders dating back over 2 centuries. This was where decisions that could affect the entire kingdom were made. Across the polished mahogany table sat Colonel James Harrison, the head of the Royal Guard, along with 3 other high-ranking officers whose grim expressions told Marcus that his situation was more serious than he had imagined. Also present was Sir Edmund Blackwell, a representative from the Foreign Ministry, whose presence meant that the incident had already escalated to the highest levels of government. Colonel Harrison was a man Marcus had always respected and admired. At 58 years old, Harrison had served his country with distinction for over 3 decades, earning his position through a combination of tactical brilliance, unwavering integrity, and complete dedication to the crown. His gray hair was always perfectly trimmed, and his uniform bore the ribbons of someone who had seen action in 3 different international conflicts. "Captain Sterling," Colonel Harrison began, his voice carrying the weight of authority but also a note of genuine concern. "Please tell us exactly what happened this morning. Leave out no details, no matter how small they might seem." Marcus recounted the entire encounter with General Kozlov, from the moment the limousine arrived at the Meridian Embassy to the final threatening words before the convoy departed. He spoke clearly and precisely, using the same tone he would use for any official report. But as he described the general's demand for a salute and his own refusal, Marcus could see the expressions around the table growing more troubled. When Marcus finished his account, the room fell silent for several minutes. Sir Edmund was taking notes on expensive stationery bearing the Foreign Ministry seal. Colonel Harrison leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of his face as he considered the implications of what he had heard. "Captain," Harrison said finally, "you understand that within 30 minutes of this incident, the Meridian ambassador was on the phone with our foreign minister demanding your immediate dismissal and a formal apology for what they are calling insulting behavior toward a distinguished military guest." Marcus felt his stomach tighten, but he maintained his composure. "Yes, sir. I expected there would be consequences." Sir Edmund looked up from his notes. "Captain Sterling, the timing of this incident could not be worse. As you know, tensions between our countries are already at a dangerous level. The Meridian Empire has deployed naval forces near our territorial waters, and there are reports of troop movements near our shared border with their allies. Any additional provocation could push us toward a military conflict that neither side really wants." "Sir," Marcus replied, "I understand the political difficulties my actions may have created, but I could not compromise the dignity of the Royal Guard or our kingdom by submitting to that man's arrogant demand." Major Patricia Wells, one of the other officers at the table, leaned forward. "Captain, help us understand your thinking. Could you not have simply given a brief salute and avoided this entire situation? A small gesture to preserve the peace." Marcus looked directly at Major Wells, a woman whose own service record was impeccable and whose opinion he valued highly. "Ma'am, with respect, it would not have been a small gesture. General Kozlov was not asking for a polite acknowledgement between professionals. He was demanding submission. He wanted me to demonstrate publicly that our kingdom's military forces would bow down to the Meridian Empire's superior power." "And you were certain of his intentions?" Colonel Harrison asked. "Absolutely, sir. The way he spoke, his body language, the presence of his security guards, the fact that he made this demand in full view of embassy staff from multiple countries, Everything about the situation was designed to humiliate me and, through me, our entire kingdom. Sir Edmund set down his pen and looked directly at Marcus. Captain, I have been dealing with the Meridian Empire for 15 years. They are a proud people with a long military tradition, and they place enormous importance on shows of respect and deference. It is entirely possible that General Kozlov genuinely believed he was entitled to a salute based on his rank and position. Then, he was mistaken, sir, Marcus replied firmly. Royal Guards do not salute foreign officers. That is not protocol, it is not tradition, and it is not appropriate under any circumstances. If General Kozlov did not understand this, perhaps his own diplomatic advisors should have informed him before he made such a demand. The room fell silent again. Marcus could see that his superiors were struggling with a difficult decision. On one hand, they knew he had acted correctly according to military protocol and Royal Guard traditions. On the other hand, his actions had created a diplomatic crisis at the worst possible moment. Colonel Harrison finally spoke. Captain Sterling, your actions were technically correct according to our regulations. No Royal Guard is required to salute foreign military personnel, regardless of their rank. However, the political reality is that your refusal has given the Meridian Empire additional justification for their aggressive posture toward our kingdom. Sir, Marcus said, are you suggesting I should have violated our protocols to appease a foreign bully? I am suggesting, Harrison replied with a slight edge to his voice, that sometimes soldiers must consider the broader consequences of their actions, not just the letter of military law. Marcus felt a flash of anger, but he controlled it carefully. Colonel, my grandfather served in the Royal Guard during the Border War of 1978. He once told me that the moment we start compromising our principles to avoid conflict, we have already lost the most important battle. Our integrity is not negotiable. Major Wells nodded slowly. That is an admirable sentiment, Captain. But integrity is a luxury that not everyone can afford during times of crisis. With respect, ma'am, I disagree. Integrity is not a luxury. It is the foundation upon which everything else rests. If we sacrifice our principles when times are difficult, then they were never really our principles at all. Sir Edmund had been listening to this exchange with growing interest. Now he leaned forward and addressed Marcus directly. Captain Sterling, let me ask you a hypothetical question. If you had known that your refusal to salute would result in the Meridian Empire launching an attack on one of our border towns, would you have made the same choice? The question hit Marcus like a physical blow. The idea that his actions might lead to innocent civilians being hurt or killed was almost unbearable to consider. But, after a moment of thought, he found his answer. Sir, if the Meridian Empire is prepared to attack innocent civilians because one of our guards refused to salute their general, then they were always going to find an excuse for aggression. Giving in to their demands would not have prevented violence. It would only have delayed it while encouraging them to make even more outrageous demands. Colonel Harrison stood up and walked to one of the tall windows that overlooked the capital city. In the distance, Marcus could see the embassy district where the confrontation had taken place just hours earlier. Captain, Harrison said without turning around, the Foreign Ministry is under enormous pressure to take disciplinary action against you. The Meridian ambassador has made it clear that this incident has severely damaged relationships between our countries. What kind of disciplinary action, sir? Harrison turned back toward the table. They want you suspended from duty pending a full investigation. They want a public apology for your behavior. And they want assurances that such an incident will never happen again. Marcus felt the room spinning slightly, but he kept his voice steady. And if I refuse to apologize for doing my duty, then you will face a court-martial for conduct prejudicial to international relations, Sir Edmund said quietly. It is a serious charge, Captain. You could face dismissal from service, loss of pension, and criminal penalties. The threat hung in the air like a dark cloud. Marcus realized that he was facing the end of everything he had worked for during his 12 years of service. His career, his reputation, his financial security, all of it could disappear because he had refused to bow down to a foreign bully. But even as he considered the personal costs, Marcus found that his resolve was only growing stronger. The idea of apologizing for standing up for his country's dignity was more repugnant to him than any punishment they could impose. Gentlemen, Marcus said, standing up and coming to attention, I understand the position you are in, and I respect the difficult decisions you have to make. But I cannot, and will not apologize for refusing to salute General Kozlov. If that means facing a court-martial, then so be it. Colonel Harrison studied Marcus's face for a long moment, looking for any sign of doubt or weakness. Finding none, he nodded slowly. Very well, Captain. You are suspended from active duty effective immediately. You will surrender your weapon and badge to Major Wells. A formal hearing will be scheduled within 2 weeks to determine what charges, if any, will be filed against you. As Marcus unbuckled his service pistol and removed his badge, he felt a mixture of sadness and pride. Sadness for the end of a career he had loved, but pride in knowing that he had stood up for something important when it mattered most. One more thing, Captain, Colonel Harrison said as Marcus prepared to leave. This incident has attracted attention from the highest levels of government. The Prime Minister himself is being briefed on the situation. Whatever happens next, your actions today will be remembered and analyzed by people far more powerful than anyone in this room. Marcus nodded and headed toward the door. As he reached for the handle, Sir Edmund called his name. Captain Sterling, the diplomat said, for what it is worth, I think you showed remarkable courage today. The question is whether courage will be enough to see you through what comes next. With those ominous words echoing in his mind, Marcus walked out of the conference room and into an uncertain future. The confrontation with General Kozlov had lasted only minutes, but its consequences would shape the rest of his life and potentially the relationship between two nations. The news of Marcus Sterling's confrontation with General Kozlov spread through the capital city like wildfire. By evening of that same day, the story was on the front page of every major newspaper, the lead story on television news programs, and trending on social media platforms across the kingdom and beyond. Marcus had returned to his small apartment near the military district feeling more alone than he had ever felt in his life. His career was in ruins, his future uncertain, and the weight of potentially triggering an international crisis pressed down on him like a physical burden. He sat in his living room, still wearing his civilian clothes from the hearing, staring at his Royal Guard uniform hanging in the closet. The first phone call came at 7:30 that evening. Marcus almost did not answer, assuming it would be another reporter trying to get an interview or a government official with more bad news. But the caller ID showed his younger sister Sarah's number, so he picked up reluctantly. Marcus, Sarah's voice was excited and proud. I just saw the news. You stood up to that arrogant general. The whole family is so proud of you. Sarah, Marcus said wearily, I appreciate your support, but I'm in serious trouble. This could end my career and land me in prison. Are you kidding me? Sarah replied. You're a hero. Do you know what people are saying? They're calling you the guard who would not bow down. Marcus, you stood up for all of us. Before Marcus could respond, his phone buzzed with another incoming call. Then another. Within minutes, his phone was ringing constantly with calls from friends, family members, former colleagues, and complete strangers who wanted to express their support for what he had done. Marcus turned off his phone and tried to eat dinner, but he had no appetite. Outside his apartment window, he could see television news trucks setting up on the street. Reporters were interviewing his neighbors, asking them what kind of person Marcus Sterling was and whether they supported his actions. At 9 o'clock, Marcus turned on the television to see what the news programs were saying about the incident. What he saw shocked him completely. The lead anchor of the National News Network was interviewing Professor Diana Matthews, a respected expert on international relations from the Royal University. Professor Matthews was explaining the significance of what had happened that morning. This incident, Professor Matthews said, represents a fundamental clash between two very different approaches to international relations. The Meridian Empire operates from a position that might makes right, that smaller countries should automatically defer to more powerful ones. Captain Sterling's refusal to salute General Kozlov was actually a defense of the principle that all sovereign nations deserve equal respect, regardless of their military or economic power. The anchor nodded thoughtfully. But some critics are saying that Captain Sterling's actions were reckless and could lead to military conflict between our countries. That argument, Professor Matthews replied firmly, puts the responsibility in the wrong place. If the Meridian Empire chooses military action because one of our guards refused an inappropriate demand, that reveals their true intentions. Captain Sterling did not create this crisis. He simply refused to participate in his own country's humiliation. Marcus was amazed to hear such strong support from someone he had never met. But it was the next segment that truly stunned him. The news program had sent reporters to interview ordinary citizens about their reactions to the story. Marcus expected to hear a mixture of opinions, with some people supporting him and others criticizing his actions as dangerous to national security. Instead, What he saw was an overwhelming outpouring of support that brought tears to his eyes. An elderly man outside a grocery store said, "My son served in the army for 20 years. He taught me that some things are more important than avoiding conflict." That young man did exactly what any decent soldier should do. A middle-aged woman at a bus stop declared, "I am tired of other countries thinking they can push us around because we are smaller than they are. Good for Captain Sterling for standing up to that bully." A group of university students had organized an impromptu demonstration outside the Royal Guard headquarters, carrying signs that read, "Honor over appeasement," and "Sterling's silver backbone." Even more surprising were the international reactions. News programs from allied countries were praising Marcus's actions as an example of principled courage in the face of intimidation. An editorial in the Times of Greater Britain called him a guard who understands that dignity cannot be negotiated away for temporary peace. But it was the call Marcus received the next morning that truly changed everything. At precisely 8 o'clock, Marcus's phone rang with a number he did not recognize. When he answered, a crisp professional voice said, "Captain Sterling, this is Private Secretary Williams from the Royal Palace. Her Majesty Queen Catherine would like to speak with you." Marcus nearly dropped the phone. In 12 years of service as a royal guard, he had seen the Queen many times during official ceremonies and state functions. But he had never spoken with her directly, and the idea that she wanted to talk to him now was almost unbelievable. "Please hold for Her Majesty," the secretary said. A moment later, Marcus heard the familiar voice that he had heard countless times on television and radio, but never directed at him personally. "Captain Sterling," Queen Catherine said, "I wanted to call you personally to express my admiration for your conduct yesterday morning. You upheld the finest traditions of the Royal Guard and brought honor to our kingdom." Marcus was so stunned that he could barely speak. "Your Majesty, thank you, Your Majesty. I only did what I believed was right." "That is precisely why your actions were so admirable," the Queen replied. "In a moment of pressure, when it would have been easy to take the path of least resistance, you chose to stand firm in defense of principles that are fundamental to who we are as a nation." "Your Majesty," Marcus managed to say, "I have been suspended from duty pending a hearing. There is talk of a court-martial." "Captain Sterling," the Queen said, her voice taking on a tone of absolute authority, "you will not face a court-martial for doing your duty. I have spoken with the Prime Minister and the Defense Secretary. Your suspension has been lifted, and you will return to active duty immediately with a commendation for exceptional service." Marcus felt the room spinning around him. "Your Majesty, I do not understand," the Foreign Ministry said. "The Foreign Ministry," the Queen interrupted, "sometimes forgets that our primary obligation is to our own people and our own principles, not to appeasing foreign bullies. Captain Sterling, you reminded all of us yesterday that some things are worth more than temporary diplomatic convenience." After the call ended, Marcus sat in his apartment trying to process what had just happened. Not only was his career saved, but he was receiving the personal support of the monarch herself. The woman who symbolized everything he had sworn to protect was telling him that he had done the right thing. Within hours, the news of the Queen's support spread throughout the kingdom and beyond. The story took on an entirely new dimension when it became clear that Captain Marcus Sterling was not just an individual guard who had defied a foreign officer, but a man whose actions had the full backing of his sovereign and his people. The reaction from the Meridian Empire was swift and furious. Their ambassador held a press conference denouncing what he called royal interference in a simple matter of diplomatic protocol. General Kozlov himself appeared on international television, claiming that the incident proved the kingdom was a rogue nation that does not respect international norms. But their protests fell on deaf ears. Other countries began speaking out in support of Marcus's actions and the kingdom's response. The Prime Minister of the Free Republic of Norland issued a statement saying, "Captain Sterling's courage reminds us all that sovereignty and dignity are not negotiable, regardless of the size of one's military." The President of the Democratic Alliance declared, "Every nation, large or small, has the right to maintain its own protocols and traditions without being bullied into submission by more powerful neighbors." What had started as an isolated incident between one guard and one general had become a rallying cry for smaller nations around the world who were tired of being intimidated by imperial powers. Marcus returned to duty 3 days after his suspension, wearing the same red uniform he had always worn but carrying himself with a new sense of purpose and pride. When he walked through the embassy district, embassy staff from friendly nations nodded respectfully, while those from the Meridian Empire and Their allies looked away uncomfortably. The confrontation had changed everything, but not in the way anyone had expected. Instead of weakening the kingdom's position, Marcus's refusal to bow down had strengthened it immeasurably. The story had captured the imagination of people around the world, turning a simple guard into a symbol of resistance against bullying and intimidation. But Marcus knew that the real test was still coming. The Meridian Empire was not the type of power that would simply accept such a public humiliation and move on. They would be planning their response, and when it came, it would test not just Marcus's courage, but the resolve of his entire kingdom. The guard who had refused to salute was about to discover that standing up to bullies sometimes means they try even harder to knock you down. 6 months after the confrontation that made him famous around the world, Captain Marcus Sterling stood once again at his post in the embassy district. But everything had changed in ways he could never have imagined. What had started as a simple refusal to salute a foreign officer had grown into something far larger and more significant than one man's stand for principle. The Meridian Empire's response to the incident had been swift and multifaceted. They had withdrawn their ambassador, imposed economic sanctions, and conducted increasingly aggressive military exercises near the kingdom's borders. But instead of intimidating Marcus's country into submission, these actions had only strengthened international support for the small kingdom that had refused to bow down. The story of the guard who would not salute had become an international phenomenon. Marcus had been interviewed by news organizations from dozens of countries. A documentary about the incident had won awards at film festivals. University professors taught courses analyzing the diplomatic and ethical implications of his actions. Most importantly, his example had inspired similar acts of courage around the world. In the Republic of Astoria, a border guard had refused to allow Meridian military officials to search civilian vehicles without proper warrants. In the Island Federation, a portmaster had denied entry to Meridian warships that were trying to use intimidation to gain access to sovereign waters. These individual acts of resistance had begun to coalesce into something unprecedented, a coordinated international movement of smaller nations standing up to imperial bullying. The kingdom had become the unofficial leader of this movement, with Marcus as its unlikely symbol. But success had come at a price. The economic sanctions imposed by the Meridian Empire and their allies had caused real hardship for ordinary citizens. Some factories had closed, unemployment had risen, and imported goods had become more expensive. Marcus was acutely aware that his decision to stand firm had affected the lives of millions of people. On this particular morning, as autumn sunlight filtered through the embassy district's trees, Marcus was preparing for what he knew would be the most important day of his life. Intelligence reports indicated that the Meridian Empire was planning what they called their final solution to the kingdom crisis. General Kozlov himself was returning to the capital, not as a diplomatic visitor this time, but as the leader of a delegation that would present an ultimatum to the kingdom's government. The terms were simple and non-negotiable. Marcus Sterling must be publicly dismissed from the Royal Guard, formally apologize to General Kozlov, and salute him in front of international television cameras. If these demands were not met within 24 hours, the Meridian Empire would impose a complete economic blockade and consider all necessary measures to protect their national honor. Everyone understood what all necessary measures meant. The Meridian Empire was preparing for war if they did not get the submission they demanded. At 10 o'clock that morning, the familiar convoy of black vehicles arrived at the embassy district. But this time, General Kozlov was not alone. Behind his limousine came vehicles carrying Meridian military attaches, government officials, and international observers who would witness whatever happened next. Marcus watched from his post as the convoy parked not at the Meridian embassy, but in the center of the district where he stood. Clearly, Kozlov intended to stage his final confrontation in the most public location possible, with representatives from multiple embassies able to observe and report what happened. General Kozlov emerged from his vehicle wearing the same metal-covered uniform Marcus remembered from their first encounter. But now the man's face showed the strain of 6 months of international controversy. His empire's reputation had suffered from the sustained criticism of their bullying tactics, and Kozlov himself had become a symbol of imperial arrogance in the international press. Behind Kozlov came an entourage of at least 20 people, including military officers, diplomats, and what appeared to be journalists with television cameras. This was clearly intended to be the final, decisive moment in a confrontation that had captured worldwide attention. As the group approached Marcus's position, He could see faces watching from the windows of every embassy building in the district. Word of what was happening had spread quickly, and it seemed like the entire diplomatic community had gathered to witness this moment. Kozlov stopped about 15 feet from Marcus and spent several seconds studying the man who had caused him so much trouble. When he finally spoke, his voice was loud enough to be heard by everyone in the area. "Captain Marcus Sterling," Kozlov announced formally, "I have returned to offer you one final opportunity to correct the grave insult you committed against the Meridian Empire 6 months ago. You will render the salute that should have been given then. You will apologize publicly for your disrespectful behavior, and you will submit your resignation from the Royal Guard as acknowledgement of your failure to maintain proper diplomatic relations." The demand hung in the air like a challenge thrown down before a duel. Marcus was acutely aware that dozens of people were watching and listening, that television cameras were recording every word, and that his response would be analyzed and debated around the world. "General Kozlov," Marcus replied, his voice carrying clearly across the silent district, "I have given careful consideration to my actions 6 months ago, and I have concluded that I acted appropriately in refusing your demand for a salute. I will not apologize for upholding the dignity of my kingdom. I will not resign my position for doing my duty, and I will not salute you today any more than I would have 6 months ago." A murmur rippled through the crowd of observers. Even though Marcus's refusal had been expected, hearing it stated so clearly and firmly in such a public setting still had dramatic impact. Kozlov's face darkened with anger, but he controlled himself with visible effort. "Captain Sterling, perhaps you do not understand the gravity of your situation. My government has prepared economic and military responses that will bring tremendous suffering to your people. You have the power to prevent this suffering by making one simple gesture of respect." Marcus felt the weight of that argument. The idea that his stubbornness might lead to war, to innocent people being hurt or killed, was a burden that had kept him awake many nights during the past 6 months. But he had reached a conclusion about the nature of bullies and the futility of appeasing them. "General," Marcus said, "you speak of a simple gesture of respect. But what you are demanding is not respect, it is submission. You want me to demonstrate publicly that your empire has the power to force representatives of sovereign nations to humiliate themselves and their countries. If I give you that demonstration today, you will simply make more demands tomorrow." "That is speculation," Kozlov replied. "What is not speculation is the suffering your people will endure if you continue this foolish resistance." Marcus nodded slowly. "General, you may be right about the suffering that will come if I refuse your demands. But I am certain about the suffering that will come if I give in to them. Because a bully who is rewarded for his behavior will always escalate his demands until the victim finds a line they cannot cross. You would only be satisfied until you found the next thing you could force us to do." At that moment, Marcus heard the sound of vehicles approaching from behind him. He turned to see a convoy of official cars flying the royal standard arriving at the embassy district. From the lead vehicle emerged Sir Edmund Blackwell from the Foreign Ministry, Colonel Harrison, and, to Marcus's amazement, Prime Minister David Crawford himself. The Prime Minister walked directly to Marcus's position, ignoring the Meridian delegation entirely. David Crawford was a man in his early 60s who had earned a reputation for quiet competence and unwavering integrity during his 15 years in politics. His presence at this confrontation sent a clear message about how seriously the government was taking this moment. "Captain Sterling," the Prime Minister said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "I have come here today to personally witness your conduct in this matter. The eyes of the world are upon us, and I want to ensure that our response accurately reflects the values and principles of our kingdom." Then, to everyone's surprise, Prime Minister Crawford turned to face General Kozlov directly. "General," Crawford said, "you have come to our capital and demanded that one of our royal guards salute you as a gesture of submission. You have threatened our economy and our security if we refuse to comply with this demand. I want you to understand clearly our government's position on this matter." The Prime Minister paused dramatically, looking around at the assembled crowd of diplomats, journalists, and observers. "Our position," Crawford continued, "is that Captain Sterling acted with honor and integrity in refusing your inappropriate demands 6 months ago. He acted with honor and integrity in refusing it again today. And he has the complete support of our government, our monarch, and our people in maintaining that position." General Kozlov's face was now red with fury. "Prime Minister Crawford, you are making a grave mistake. My empire has the power to destroy your economy, and crush your military forces. Your little kingdom cannot stand against us. General Kozlov, the Prime Minister, replied calmly. You are absolutely correct that your empire is more powerful than our kingdom. But power and right are not the same thing. And we have discovered over these past 6 months that we are not standing alone. As if summoned by those words, Marcus noticed movement at the edges of the embassy district. Ambassadors and senior diplomats from friendly nations were emerging from their buildings and walking toward the confrontation. The ambassador from Greater Britain, the representative from the Free Republic of Norland, the delegate from the Island Federation, and diplomats from a dozen other countries formed a loose semicircle around the area. The ambassador from Greater Britain stepped forward and addressed General Kozlov directly. General, she said, I have been instructed by my government to inform you that any economic or military action taken against this kingdom in response to Captain Sterling's refusal to salute you will be considered an act of aggression against all nations that value sovereignty and dignity. We stand with our friends. One by one, the other ambassadors voiced similar statements of support. What General Kozlov had intended as an isolated confrontation between his empire and one small kingdom had become a face-off between two competing visions of how nations should treat each other. Marcus watched this extraordinary scene unfold with a mixture of pride and humility. What had started as his personal decision to refuse an inappropriate demand had grown into something far larger than himself. He had become the symbol of a principle that resonated with people around the world. General Kozlov looked around at the assembled diplomats, clearly recognizing that his position had become untenable. The Meridian Empire was powerful, but it was not powerful enough to take on a coalition of nations that had decided to stand together. This is not over, Kozlov said finally, his voice tight with controlled rage. The Meridian Empire will not forget this insult. General, Marcus said quietly, the only insult here is your assumption that might gives you the right to humiliate others. Captain Marcus Sterling of the Royal Guard will never salute you, today or any other day. Not because I hate your country or disrespect your culture, but because some principles are worth more than temporary peace. With those words, the confrontation that had begun 6 months earlier finally reached its conclusion. General Kozlov and his delegation returned to their vehicles and left the embassy district, their threat empty and their intimidation unsuccessful. As the Meridian convoy disappeared around the corner, the assembled diplomats began to disperse. But not before several of them approached Marcus personally to express their admiration for his courage and their gratitude for reminding the world that dignity cannot be negotiated away. Prime Minister Crawford was the last to leave. Before departing, he shook Marcus's hand and said quietly, Captain, your actions have shown the world what our kingdom stands for. You have made us all proud. As the embassy district returned to its normal quiet routine, Marcus resumed his post with a deep sense of satisfaction. He had faced the greatest test of his life and emerged with his principles intact. More importantly, he had helped demonstrate that small nations did not have to submit to imperial bullying, and that courage could inspire others to stand up for what was right. The guard who had refused to salute had become something he never intended to be, a symbol of resistance, dignity, and the power of ordinary people to make extraordinary differences when they choose to stand firm in defense of their principles. In the months and years that followed, the incident would be remembered as a turning point in international relations, the moment when the world learned that might does not automatically make right, and that sometimes the most important battles are won not by armies, but by individuals who refuse to compromise their integrity even when the cost seems unbearable. Captain Marcus Sterling returned to his duties as a royal guard, but he would never again be just another soldier in a red uniform. He had become a living reminder that honor, courage, and principle are forces more powerful than any empire, and that the future belongs to those brave enough to defend them.